Howdy guys, how are you guys doing? Today we have an incredibly special video. I honestly, I'm shaking out of the emotion that I have to watch this video that I've been waiting so long to watch. If you noticed, new office, maybe give me a like for that. Tell me what do you think. But, we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about Kraut, the man who creates these videos. These videos are incredible. I love them. I love the research that he does on them. I love the content. I mean, this is the finale. Okay, this is part 3. This is Return of the Jedi, bro. This is gonna be good. So without further ado, let's just go for it, man. The Mexican-American border from war to war.
Part 3 of
El tiempo de la revolución.
In the city of Nogales, Sonora, you will find that the largest employers are American companies, and you will find those in the Maquiladora Manufacturing Industry Park. Within its premises, there are US companies that produce anything from musical instruments to hospital clothing to suitcases to sunglasses to garage doors. This practice of American business moving into Mexico to acquire its cheap labor started over 100 years ago, and Nogales' neighboring county of Cananea is one of the first places where that began. Cananea has some of the richest copper ore deposits in the region. Today, these mines are owned by the state-owned mining corporation Grupo Mexico and by the richest man in Mexico, and formerly richest man in the world, the billionaire Carlos Slim. However, that is not how mining started here. The industrial monopoly economy of Mexico that Diaz had established was unable to tap many resources of the country. The monopoly owners were preoccupied with their own little parcels of the economy, and since Mexican capital was restricted within the oligarchy and not widely available, many economic sectors were neglected. The result was an economic underdevelopment of many parts of the country.
Yeah, that's even the case today. Like, everything is so Mexico City centric that honestly, a lot of times people, businesses, even their own government forgets that the rest of the country exists. So, that's how it works today. You can imagine how it worked 100 years ago.
That the elites just simply didn't care about, and one of these places was the North. However, American prospectors, bankers, and entrepreneurs could take credits and loans from banks in the United States where capital was available to everyone, to then buy the licenses from the Mexican government. This angered sections of the Mexican public who would have preferred to do so themselves. Having access to American industry meant that these Americans began building textile and other industries in central Mexico as well, while the Mexican oligarchs didn't bother and just kept sitting on their established plantations. By 1900, over 90% of all industry in Mexico was owned by foreigners. And 70% of these foreigners were Americans. The ultimate result of the Porfiriato was one that replicated itself in many Latin American countries. The corrupt rule of caudillo oligarchs who limited the economic freedoms of their citizens with exclusionary economic institutions resulted in foreigners with foreign capital and foreign machinery and foreign innovations taking over large swaths of national economies that the kleptocratic local governments were too incompetent to develop or just disinterested in, while the general public could do nothing but watch. The legacies of this precarious socio-economic development reverberate throughout Latin America to this very day. One of the American entrepreneurs was William Green, a Wisconsin rancher who had the capital and American credit that decades of decentralized and open economic development had made available in the United States. With that capital, which was inaccessible to the overwhelming majority of Mexicans within their own exclusionary Mexican economy, he was able to buy a grant from the Mexican government in 1899 to open copper mines in Cananea. Due to the corruption of the Mexican state, he was also able to bribe himself into extraordinary positions of power. Green, throughout his career, had spent a substantial time doing business in the American frontier, even murdering a man in Tombstone, Arizona. He wasn't the type of person who liked government oversight, and was therefore able, within the isolated and often lawless lands of northern Mexico, to build almost his own little fiefdom around the town of Cananea, just like the patrons. However, the resentment amongst the local Latino population that he hired started to spread when he imported American miners who earned 5 pesos a day for the same work that earned the Mexican worker only 2 pesos a day. Meanwhile, in central Mexico, a crisis in the textile industry caused a third of its workers to lose their jobs. This resulted in strikes and a consequent brutal crackdown by the Mexican military, which gained increasing popularity for the opposition politician Francisco Madero. In panic, Diaz suspended the already fraudulent elections and had Madero exiled to the United States. This became the starting shot of the Mexican Revolution of 1910 and the consequent Civil War. The Mexican Revolution is unique. It is an extremely complex and a very convoluted story of betrayals and political maneuvering. But it has always had a special place in the hearts and minds of many historians, but also especially in the hearts and minds of revolutionaries. The reason for this is that revolutions are often romanticized as uprisings of the impoverished and poor, but that is largely a romantic myth. In reality, the vast majority of revolutions were led by educated middle and upper class peoples. Often revolutions happen to preserve a status quo and not to abolish it. But not so here. The Mexican Revolution is an exception to what is largely a romantic myth. The Mexican Revolution of 1910 genuinely was a spontaneous uprising of the disenfranchised and impoverished masses against those who had exploited them. It was also the first revolution of the 20th century, followed by the Chinese Revolution and the Russian Revolution. Within it,
Also
you will find
incredibly
the themes
important.
of all revolutions of the 20th century: rebellion against oppressive government, against economic exploitation, and against foreign influence and invaders, and the struggle for social reform and justice. Revolutionary Mexico was also the first 20th century society to engage in revolutionary social experimentation, from nationalism to anarchism to socialism, indigenous liberation to liberal democracy. It had famous and charismatic leaders such as Emiliano Zapata and his Zapatistas, who fought for indigenous lands to be taken from large landowners and made communal land again. Pancho Villa, who although pragmatic, mainly fought for what he saw as a struggle of the Mexican working class to have their land returned. And Francisco Madero, who wanted a legalist liberal democracy with land returned.
You know, the Mexican Revolution is something that's... it's such a long subject. It's really complex. Even for me, it's just hard to get a grasp of it. So I can't imagine what Kraut had to go just to do this video. A lot of reading, I can tell you, a lot of reading. I don't know how many sources there are in English. I guess there's plenty about the Mexican Revolution, but you know. By the way, have you noticed my Union Jack shirt? It's probably not the most appropriate way of starting this video.
To peasants as their private property. And one of the main reasons why the popular romantic image of this revolution endures to this very day is that unlike most other 20th century revolutions, this revolution succeeded, and technically it is still with us. The Beiyang Republic is gone, the Spanish Republic is but a nostalgic memory, the Soviet Union is no more. But the Mexican Republic?
It's still here.
It still stands. The revolution first flared up in the north with striking miners and instantly spread south to plantation laborers. Sensing the danger to themselves in this situation, the caudillos participated in this initial uprising and a new government was put in place under Francisco Madero. However, that government kept the power structures of the previous government and even some of the same people. It negotiated land reform, but did so tacitly at best, handing out largely worthless scraps of desert to plantation laborers. The land reform also included a scam that redistributed large swaths of land to already wealthy landowners. This worked because the government promised to return land that was illegally seized during the rule of Diaz. However, very little land was technically illegally seized, since Diaz had just legalized the land seizures of his allies and business partners. Additionally, the government didn't reform and kept the hated Mexican army. The Mexican army had come to be one of the most hated institutions of the country, ruthlessly used as a brutal and blunt tool to crush civil discontent, brutalize the public, and dispossess farmers by seizing their lands. So, revolution flared up again, or more precisely several revolutions, counter-revolutions and more. A rebellion in the north that sought to overthrow the government. The government crushed that rebellion. But what the government could not get control over were the Zapatistas and the anarchists. There's a good reason for this: the issue of land. land reform was, and to an extent still is, one of the most important and divisive political issues in Mexico and large parts of Latin America. In the United States, land had often been handed out for free to settlers over the centuries, and property ownership became common and widespread. In Mexico, land had been owned by a transplant Spanish aristocracy, a social structure reinforced by post-colonial oligarchs and then by...
This is what he was talking about in the first part. He was like, you know, this is how Mexico, colonial Mexico and colonial America were different. And yeah, I mean, it's still an issue today, I guess.
Porfiriato. Millions of acres of farmland were in the hands of an extremely small minority, while millions of small peasants lived in poverty without property. The resolution of this inequality would be the main economic and political challenge.
I mean, and this is probably a problem everywhere. I read the other day that Bill Gates is like the largest private landowner in America, and he owns a bunch of land. Yeah, I guess this happens everywhere.
Throughout the 20th century, and to a degree still today. The Zapatistas offered a solution to the disenfranchised peasantry: communal land ownership in collective farms. Farmland had been owned communally by Native American communities before the Porfiriato, and the Zapatistas demanded a return to that system. And that was a very attractive proposition to the largely mestizo and horribly disenfranchised and exploited Mexican peasantry, who joined the Zapatistas en masse.
Yes.
While the government was able to crush initial counter-revolutionary uprisings by army officers and members of the old elite, it was unable to find and implement any meaningful solutions for the issues that had caused the revolution in the first place. It had negotiated an alliance with the socialists and the anarchists, but those started to openly mock the weak government and its ineffectiveness. The Zapatistas started forming their communal farms, rebelled, and seized control of the country's sugar plantations, and the richest state, Morelos. And the socialists went on strikes in cities, while the government increasingly started falling apart. Madero was an idealist, a man with good intentions. He wanted to establish American democracy in Mexico. He dreamt of a Mexico that would become a free republic with the same standard of living and socio-political structure and constitutional liberties as the United States.
That's still the goal,
But
man.
ideals alone cannot build a functioning state or reform a society. His idealism blinded him and his government to the fundamental flaws and realities of the Mexican state they had inherited. The United States was a country of small property owners. Government accountability, separation of powers, and an independent judiciary were freely available.
I love the USA, man.
None of these institutions existed in Mexico. Building an American-style republic on the disheveled monstrosity that was the Porfiriato was simply an impossibility. What Madero didn't realize was that the entire socio-economic order of the Porfiriato was doomed to failure and the root cause of the revolution itself. It would have to go for any change to even be possible. Throughout the revolution, American industrialists had fled Mexico, and when Madero started negotiating with socialist workers in the cities, the US ambassador conspired with a nephew of Diaz to organize a coup that ended with the assassination of Madero and the end of the first revolutionary government. The new counter-revolutionary regime, led by Victoriano Huerta, immediately marched south to try and crush the Zapatistas, and failed miserably. The counter-revolutionary regime got bogged down in an unwinnable guerrilla war in the rugged mountains and jungles of the south.
Kind of
the
like
army
Vietnam.
engaged in a vicious scorched earth campaign, burning towns and villages and conducting mass executions and massacres. On its way south, it also...
Yeah, y'all remember when we saw Geography Now? And if you haven't watched that video, you can go watch it. You know, a lot of those regions in southern Mexico that have more of a jungle vibe and are kind of like Vietnam. You can think about it like Vietnam. It's just really hard to get control. And even today, a lot of those regions are like not independent or even semi-independent, but they have like some sort of level of local autonomy. That's really hard for me to explain because I don't know the politics. And of course, I don't even know how to translate them. But yeah, you can see like Mexico's Vietnam, which is in our own soil, which is weird.
Massacred the liberal government of Cuernavaca. The result of this indiscriminate brutality, in particular since it was often directed against civilians and people who were not even Zapatistas, was that thousands went to join the Zapatistas. And while failing in the south, in the north, the nail in the coffin of the Huerta regime came to rise. a loose set of rebels, revolutionaries, anarchists, socialists, smugglers, cowboys, deserted soldiers, lumberjacks, small farmers, and many more, stretching from Sonora to Chihuahua to Coahuila, united and led by the famous Pancho Villa. Within a year, they seized control of the Northwest,
What a great
managed to build a functioning war economy, redistributed land, and even established a central bank to finance their reforms. And even though the United States supported the regime, the army of Pancho Villa just bought modern American military equipment, not from the American government, but from American companies, Remington, Colt, and DuPont, in El Paso and Austin. They even bought fuel from Texas oil barons with little to no resistance. The army of Pancho Villa, known as the División del Norte, ended up being better equipped than the government.
I mean, they were
fighting
cowboys.
force
They were
of the revolution.
true Mexican
It became
cowboys.
especially known for its cavalry, cowboys and
Our
horseback,
Wild
packed
West.
with bandoliers and modern Mauser rifles, who quickly and efficiently caused havoc among enemy forces. In 1914, that army marched south and took Zacatecas. With that, Pancho Villa controlled much of the north, with the exception of the northeast, which was controlled by different rebels under Governor Carranza and General Obregón, who had been loyal to Madero and therefore rebelled against Huerta as constitutionalists. The Huerta regime
Man,
was
I'm
now
back in
boxed
high school,
between
man.
Pancho Villa, Carranza, and the Zapatistas. But this is where someone else moved into the picture. The army of Pancho Villa had committed several atrocious war crimes, such as mass executions of surrendered soldiers, and in the far north it started to increasingly lose control along the border. Banditry started to increase, but not significantly enough to actually harm the United States. But as an excuse, it was enough for them. Under the pretense of intervening against banditry, the American army started to intervene in 1914. The actual intention was to guide the revolution into a government in their favor and to
Woodrow
secure the
Wilson,
Mexican
you
assets
son of a
American
bitch.
industrialists. The Americans landed in Veracruz and occupied it, but the occupation ended up being a disaster. Mexican civilians started shooting at the Americans. The American Navy consequently bombarded the city indiscriminately and eventually had to pull out. Although the Americans would conduct several incursions into northern Mexico, they had to increasingly come to terms with the fact that they would not be guiding the outcome of this revolution. The main effect their intervention had in the end was that the Zapatistas, Constitutionalists, and the army of Pancho Villa formed an alliance against the Huerta regime. And shortly after, Pancho Villa inflicted a crushing defeat against the Huerta government at the Battle of Torreon. After which the Mexican army, an institution that was feared and hated by the Mexican people, basically fell apart. Huerta resigned and fled to the United States, where he was imprisoned and probably murdered. And this started a rush on the capital.
Probably.
And Obregón was the first to arrive. The Constitutionalists promised concessions to factory workers and the freedom for all workers to organize in labor unions, while Pancho Villa and Zapata launched an appeal to the rural peasants. At this point in the revolution, with all counter-revolutionary forces defeated or in shambles, the conflict that arose was between left-wing forces, the constitutionalist labor movement of the progressive socialist General Obregón, and the more conservative Carranza controlled the cities. The Zapatistas and army of Pancho Villa, with their anarchist farming communes and demands for land reform, held power in the countryside. The Americans were shocked by what they perceived as widespread radicalism. They offered support to the Constitutionalists in return for American control of Mexican oil and were angrily rebuffed. They finally realized at this point that a regime that continued the Porfiriatio status quo was impossible and would only lead to more uprisings. So they begrudgingly decided to throw their support behind the Constitutionalists, who, although they demanded massive redistribution of land and wealth, at least wanted such redistributed as private property. The Constitutionalists announced an enormous land reform package. Every single Mexican was eligible for the program, and would essentially divide up the large majority of Mexican farmland among the poor peasantry as private property. Pancho Villa and Zapata, who had advocated for collectivized communal farms, were outraged and called on their supporters to revolt. But they gravely underestimated their opponents. Within weeks, the Constitutionalists recruited amongst the workers of the cities what became known as the Red Battalions, soldiers sworn to establish a socialist workers' republic, ready and eager to face the Zapatistas in battle. The First World War had drawn in the help of German military advisors for the Constitutionalists, who as a result employed the tactics of barbed wire funneling enemies
Zimmermann
into machine
telegram.
gun nests, tactics that were at the same time being used across the ocean in the fields of Flanders. Pancho Villa's famous cavalry was torn up by machine guns and barbed wire, just as the English cavalry had been torn up in Belgium. The Constitutionalist army took the north, but the revolution, which had by this point turned into a civil war, grinded out into a brutal guerrilla war. However, the Constitutional Army was by no means a united force. It was a large coalition of socialist workers, middle-class citizens, and the upper classes, who had begrudgingly thrown their weight in with the Constitutionalists out of pragmatism. They disagreed on what the economy and society of the new Mexico should be. Many among the upper classes also demanded a limitation on democracy. Many of the workers had aspirations of ending the industrial economic order and returning to a pre-industrial but socialist artisan economy. Others dreamt of carrying the revolution out of Mexico into the United States and launch a global revolution of industrial workers. Some were even urban anarchist syndicalists demanding the organization of cities into worker syndicates. Many came together in the Casa movement, a labor union movement that was set on a course of confrontation with the other elements of the constitutionalist movement. By 1916, that confrontation came with nationwide strikes. The government reacted by implementing martial law and disbanding the Red Battalions. The constitutionalist movement was again weakened, while in the south, Zapata declared the abolition of private property to rally more peasants to the anarchist cause, and in the north, Pancho Villa rebuilt his strength for a final showdown with the constitutionalists in Sonora. The Americans wanted Villa to lose, so they moved artillery into Sonora, which helped the constitutionalists win. Pancho Villa consequently decided to invade the United States, the first and so far last invasion of America since the War of 1812. He raided and briefly occupied parts of New Mexico and then retreated back across the border. And this is where the Americans made a big mistake. They invaded northern Mexico in pursuit of Pancho Villa, and that, together with Villa's previous daring raid across the border, elevated Pancho Villa to a...
Probably a lot of you American viewers don't like this guy, but the guy was smart. At the very least, you can give him that.
The status of national hero in
a true
Mexico.
bandit.
The guy who took the fight to the gringos. The constitutionalist government had to embarrassingly declare a defensive line against the Americans, which the American army blundered into and lost a fight. The Americans realized far too late that Pancho Villa had just baited them into Mexico, so he could kick them around on his own home turf and elevate his own national status as a defender from foreign invaders. The Americans had to retreat out of Mexico empty-handed. All they had accomplished were pro-Villa uprisings that helped Pancho Villa re-establish power over large parts of the north. In this situation, the constitutional president Carranza gave in to the demands by the progressive General Obregón to write a new Mexican constitution. It enshrined the shorelines, frontiers, and natural resources of Mexico as non-violatable property of the people as a community personified through the state, enshrining thereby into law national industries and a clear boundary that the Americans could not cross, a democratic system under a centralized government, a right to universal free education, to healthcare, to the formation of labor unions, a right to rural communities to own their local land, and a right to strike. This constitution, the most progressive at the time, would form the foundation for an enormous transformation of the Mexican economy and society, and would undo the economic order of the Porfiriato. It settled the internal disputes of the constitutionalist movement, but the Civil War was not yet over. It grinded on into a long, protracted slog of a guerrilla war and counter-insurgency warfare between the warring camps. But as it slogged on over the years, the reforms of the constitutionalist government took hold. Land was redistributed, a national oil industry created, that in turn created jobs and provided funds for public services. As life improved, the Zapatistas and Pancho Villa started losing more and more support. In 1920, Carranza made the mistake of having Emilio Zapata assassinated. It led to the collapse of the armed resistance and the Zapatistas, but made him a martyr for future revolutionaries. In the north, Pancho Villa's forces started to act with increasing brutality, not just against the government, but against civilians. Pancho Villa ended up being seen as nothing but a bandit and was widely hated. Carranza, though, slacked behind in agricultural reform and the redistribution of land to appease his wealthier supporters in the Mexican elite. So by 1920, his once ally, the progressive socialist Obregón, staged a coup and had him murdered. Obregón then made peace with Pancho Villa in exchange for a large hacienda. The revolutionary, in the end, ended up as a plantation owner, like the very people he had once rebelled against. At the end of this Game of Thrones-esque series of events that would make a great TV series or video game, one of the few occasions where a history book reads like a Shakespeare play.
The Oxford History of Mexico, wow.
Alvaro Obregón was the last man standing, elected president in 1920, and began a project of building a leftist Mexican republic. The republic born from this revolution was a famously leftist and often romanticized republic. The republic that gave Trotsky refuge, redistributed land,
that is true.
Nazi
He was actually murdered here, wasn't he?
And sent weapons and volunteers to help the Spanish Republic in its war against fascism. In its initial years, it was very decentralized, and many social reforms came through the efforts of state governments. The governments of Veracruz, Michoacán, Yucatan, Chiapas, and other states encouraged the creation of agrarian leagues and farmer labor unions, which came together as the National Peasant League. The government of Yucatan also was the first to introduce women's suffrage, legalize divorce, and encourage the election of women into office, resulting in the founding of the National Feminist League. And the government of Tabasco implemented radical cultural reforms to cut down on the power of the Catholic Church over society and economy, separating church and state for the first time. In 1924, Obregón could not run for president again, and Plutarco Calles became president. 5 years later, founding the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, or Party of the Institutionalized Revolution. This political party would have an enormous impact on Mexico and resulted in Mexico going a decidedly separate path from other Latin American states. Remember how the Mexican army had fallen apart after its defeat to Pancho Villa? The Mexican army would be rebuilt after the revolution, but under the PRI government became a different institution. It was stripped of any political powers or influence and placed in its entirety under civilian control. This may be normal where you live, but it is very special in a Latin American context. In no other Latin American country did that process take place until very recently. Armies remained political institutions of power from Chile to Argentina to Venezuela to Colombia to Guatemala. And in these countries, their armies would abuse that political power to severely traumatize and harm their societies. And Mexico avoided these traumas of military dictatorship. Civilian control over the army is probably the biggest and most important accomplishment of the PRI. Additionally, all these decentralized movements and institutions that had sprung up across the country to advance social progress were united under national umbrella organizations. The intention behind this was to turn the revolution into a state and continue it. A national bank was founded that provided credit for impoverished farm owners to take over the old haciendas and plantations, to build massive collectively owned cooperative farms. Nationalizations across the country created national industries. A welfare state was established to provide free healthcare and other services. Education, which had been declared a constitutional right, was made widely available to all for free. All of it was managed by a centralized state under the PRI. Mobile teachers, an enormous program of building schools throughout even the hardest to reach corners of the country. The end of illiteracy, the building of hospitals in all corners of the country, the emancipation of women, jobs, housing, and so much more. The economic structures of the Porfiriato were completely dismantled. Post-revolutionary Mexico was one of the most advanced societies of its time. In many of its social reforms and programs, it was even decades ahead of
how
other countries.
Things change.
This, however, inevitably leads to one question. What went wrong?
Yeah, exactly.
The Americans did not undermine this new state, even though they may have initially wanted to. During the First World War, a request by Germany to Mexico to join the war against America and annex its former territory further fueled American distrust of Mexico, even though Mexico declined the German proposal and was well, in no position to even fight any war against America. Because, it was kind of fighting itself already. Fear-mongering politicians in Washington rambled about Soviet Mexico, and when Mexico nationalized its oil industry, even demanded military intervention to overturn the republic. During the revolution, relations between the two had severely deteriorated. A once unguarded border was now tightly guarded and patrolled. The popular image of Mexico in the American imagination changed drastically. Mexicans started to be depicted and seen as devious gangsters, bandits, and dangerous political radicals. But over time, the Americans came to terms with their neighbors. By the 1930s, American politicians even advocated for copying some Mexican educational reforms. The Porfiriato may have also been dead, but let us ask this. How much different truly was this new republic? The new Mexico was a state controlled by a centralized government which had enormous control over the economy. The PRI and its institutions came to dominate many aspects of people's lives. If you wanted a farm job, you had to be part of the Farm Laborers Union. Wanted a job in the judiciary, might be best to be a party member. Jobs and prospects with engineering, mining, and many other sectors became also a tightly controlled domain of an enormous state apparatus controlled by the PRI. Mexico became a one-party state. Political upheaval and pluralism got choked out by that state apparatus, not through force, not through censorship, oppression, or brutality, but through institutions, through bureaucracy. The PRI created a system in which political participation was meant to be conducted through the institutions of the PRI, party-controlled institutions that became the state. But rather than forming political discourse, a process vital for the advancement of reform, change in power, and the resolution of political...
You gotta remember, we were pretty much a one-party state until like 20 years ago. Like, it was a really long time that this whole thing lasted, and it ended fairly recently. I mean, I was already born when we became a multi-party system.
Political conflict and disagreement, it merely created a process of scheming for positions of power within a single party system. Many political movements emerged to oppose the PRI, but neither had access to these large institutions, and therefore all of them failed or became subsumed by the PRI. Much of the legal framework of pre-revolutionary Mexico had simply been adopted by the PRI and continued, and in many ways the political structures were very similar. There were no more sugar barons and enormous plantation owners like in the Porfiriato, but you had a lot of bureaucrats who controlled large economic and social institutions. Your ability to do business in Mexico was no longer dependent upon the approval of a sugar baron like in the Porfiriato, but it was still dependent on the approval of a state bureaucrat. Your ability to engage in politics was no longer dependent on the approval of a caudillo like under the Porfiriato, but it now was dependent on the approval of the PRI. If you were a Mexican farmer during the 1920s, your life was probably better than that of an American farmer. Throughout the 1920s, the economy of small farmers in the United States collapsed. Many of them migrated into California. The small farms were bought up by corporate farms, who brought in their tractors and mechanized agriculture to transform American agriculture into a billion-dollar mass production industry. During that time, John Steinbeck described the new mechanized American farm laborer in that book you should have read in high school if you are American, but let's be honest, you probably didn't read it.
He loved the land no more than the bank loved the land. He could admire the tractor, its machined surfaces, its surge of power, the roar of detonating cylinders, but it was not his tractor. Behind the tractor rolled the shining discs, cutting the earth with blades, not plowing, but surgery, pushing the cut earth to the right where the second row cut it and pushed it to the left, slicing blades shining, polished by the cut earth. And pulled behind the discs, the harrows combing with iron teeth so that the little clods broke up and the earth lay smooth. But behind the harrows, the long cedars, 12 curved iron peens erected in foundry, orgasms set by gears, raping methodically, raping without passion. The driver sat in his iron seat, and he was proud of the straight lines he did not will, proud of the tractor he did not own or love, proud of the power he could not control. And when that crop grew and was harvested, no man had crumbled a hot clod in his fingers and let the earth sift past his fingertips. No man had touched the seed or lusted for the growth. Men ate what they had not raised, had no connection with the bread. The land bore under iron, and under iron gradually died, for it was not loved or hated. It had no prayers or curses.
Okay.
In contrast, the Mexican farmer received land or became part of a cooperative farm. He joined a farmers' union that guaranteed his wages. He received access to healthcare and education. He learned to read and write. He received a roof over his head. He no longer had to worry over how to provide for his family. In fact, he could rest assured that his children may be the first in his family to go to college. The economic reforms combined with social reforms made the lives of average Mexicans a lot easier, comfortable, and prosperous. But
what happened?
as clear-cut as these contrasts may be, Mexico actually took an enormous step backward. Creative destruction is an economic concept described by the Austrian economist Josef Schumpeter. It describes the process by which capital and the means of production are continually destroyed by creative forces of capital to create new capital and new means of production.
Okay.
The industries that evolved around the caring and feeding of horses were destroyed by the car, but generated new industries around the maintenance of the car. Schumpeter was a Marxist. He believed that creative destruction was a force that would eventually lead to the collapse of capitalism. That, of course, did not happen. Nevertheless, the simple observation holds true that innovation drives the creation and reinvigoration of new economic sectors at the expense of old. As such, it became widely accepted as a concept among more serious economists. The death of the American small farm was a process of creative destruction. Industrialized agriculture with its tractors and machines produced more at less of a cost. The small American farmer died. The big American farmer lived. There are no more smiths producing horseshoes for horses to plow the fields of Oklahoma, but there are engineers maintaining the tractors that do. This process was not dictated by governments, but came to be through a process of free competition within the market system of the United States, a process that did not exist in Mexico. During the Porfiriato, the plantation owners had not bothered innovating because they sat comfortably in an unchallenged position of wealth and power with no competition. And now, in PRI Mexico, the cooperative farmer had no need to innovate and no need to upscale or improve the means of production. Throughout Mexico, in fact, the system of nationalized economic sectors stifled entrepreneurship and innovation. Mexican engineers didn't innovate cars, consumer goods, fridges, food preservatives, electric ovens, home heating systems, radios, TVs, or any of the other things that American open economies produced in the coming decades. It stagnated. It produced raw materials and foodstuffs for foreign and domestic markets, just as the Porfiriato had. And by the 1940s, the system of governance established started to show what would become one of its biggest weaknesses, and ultimately cause its demise. Smaller private hacienda owners started receiving ever-increasing grants. American corporations received land grants.
Shut up and take my pesos.
Distribution to small farmers dropped by 50% in 1943. Mexican industrialists created business associations tied within and connected to the PRI. As mentioned before, the political process of dialogue, discussion, and public participation and reform had been replaced by scheming within the state apparatus of the PRI. The political and economic power structure consequently remained closed off to public participation. Where once there were mining oligarchs with political power, there now were bureaucrats in a national oil industry with political power. Where once there were industrial monopolists, there now was a state business federation. The general public could themselves only participate in politics or business through the PRI. The economic structure of Mexico therefore remained exclusionary, and the political system also remained exclusionary. In many ways, the socio-political structures of colonial Spain that had adapted into an independent Mexico and then adapted into an industrialized Mexico now continued within a socialist republic.
Yes. Sad but true. Chapter 9. Is that 9? Who wants to be a billionaire? I think I might know what's this gonna be about. I think I know.
In 1947, the Mexican economist Daniel Cosio Villegas wrote and published a scathing attack against the Mexican state. In his words, the revolution had
exterminated an entire generation of men and entire groups and institutions. It completely wiped out the army and the Porfirian bureaucracy. It ended with the strongest and richest class, the large and medium-sized farmers, thus disappearing all the upper bourgeoisie and much of the small. Many of the best sources of national wealth, transportation, the sugar industry, all livestock and more languished to the very brink of extinction. Even large professional groups, university teachers for example, saw their ranks so diminished that their cadres properly ceased to exist. The revolution, in short, created an enormous wealth vacuum and indeed the social and economic hierarchy carved out for almost half a century.
To him, the revolution had been driven by socialism, liberalism, and nationalism. But the revolution had failed to find a compromise between rival political forces to bring them to a table and establish a means of governance that gave a voice to all. Instead, these forces ended up in a civil war against each other. All the revolution had done in the end was destroy. It had burnt the old Mexico to cinders, but not created any compromise or any institutions in its place that could sufficiently address the issues that had plagued the country since its inception. The revolution had destroyed the dictatorship, but it had not created a democracy. The revolution had destroyed the large landowners, caudillos, and their enormous plantations and haciendas, but it had not created a framework for an efficient agriculture and economy in its stead. The revolution had failed to alleviate inequality and poverty. It had failed to even create political participation by the public. To him, the Mexican Congress was also one of the most suffocating institutions that existed. In it, just as the caudillos before them, there was no debate in this house, even though it was now a chamber of a republic. No discourse, no exchange of opinions, no debates, no discussions, no wrestling over
Just
votes,
one
no public
party
representation,
system.
no nothing. The PRI representatives met up, swore an oath, and then schemed within the structures of a one-party state. For Villegas, this state was doomed. If the PRI would not radically change course, the state it had built would merely repeat the old habits and mistakes of the failed states that had preceded it. But Villegas was ignored, because the 1940s brought an economic boom. However, not through the efforts or innovations of Mexicans, but due to the entanglements of its neighbor. The Second World War had created a huge labor shortage throughout the United States. Additionally, many other allied nations relied heavily on the labor force of Latin American nations to produce for the war.
Wow.
Mexican laborers began migrating back and forth across the border to work on farms and in factories, a process that in a way continues to this very day. The Mexican government at the time believed that the only way to modernize the Mexican economy was through foreign investment and innovation. It consequently opened the country and its cheap labor force increasingly for foreign companies. What, however, is in retrospect frequently overlooked is how incredibly corrupt the Mexican government at the time was and continued to be. Miguel Alemán Valdés, the 53rd president, amassed a fortune during his time in office that a public servant should have never been able to acquire. It was also Valdés who shaped and cemented the political institutions of Mexico for the latter half of the 20th century. He bribed political opponents into not challenging him. He bribed party officials to remain loyal to him. He created a system of patronage and loyalty through appointments, grants for his wealthy friends in business,
This is important.
and bribery that spread through and was copied throughout many institutions of the state and economy. Government corruption in any way, shape and form is always poison to any state or economy. If you have to pay bribes to remain in business, it creates an unfair system of advantage that renders the wider economy uncompetitive and stifles innovation. Small businesses start dying off and are eventually barely even started up. As the Porfiriato showed us, it also invited exceeding foreign business and political influence. And it also does nothing to share the fruits of any economic growth among the wider population. Valdez also ended the secularization process of the Republic, permitting the Catholic Church to regain much of its pre-revolutionary influence. He subtly limited the power of the labor unions to have them subdued under the control of the party and state bureaucrats, who were able to strip them of powers when in need of appeasing private interests. And most cynical of all, he instituted a subtle system of state repression. When we think of state repression, the images we conjure up are often those of tanks rolling over people, a secret police whisking people away to dark, unknown dungeons, or of camps where those the state deems undesirable are exterminated. This, to an extent, was what state oppression looked like in many Latin American military dictatorships, but the system of state repression implemented in PRI Mexico was far more insidious and subtle. People critical of the government, like Narciso Bassols, were just put under state surveillance, harassed, and their career and job prospects ruined. They were barred from public life, had defamatory articles published about them, and were simply gradually discredited and unpersoned. Besides the beginning of Mexican migrant labor into the United States during the 1940s, there would be another very significant development along the border. One that would have disastrous consequences, but had its origins not in Mexico, but in the United States, where during the 1920s, the Americans prohibited the production, sale, and consumption of alcohol and opium.
Prohibition,
Throughout the
we
hills
watched
of
that.
Sinaloa, Mexican farmers had always grown poppies for local production of morphine for medical use. The wife of a petty Mexican crook and marijuana smuggler by the name of Ignacia Yasso seized this as an opportunity. And like her husband, she quickly discovered the enormous economic potential of the region. She organized a massacre of the Chinese gang.
Is this gonna be the start of the cartels? I think this is where this is leading to, which is very interesting and of course an incredible, important part of Mexico, especially to understand modern Mexico.
Gangsters that ran the morphium trade in the region and started buying Sinaloan opium, which she had manufactured into heroin for further sale. The base of her operation was the small border town of Ciudad Juarez, where she would become known as La Nacha. Whatever the Americans who were going through a socio-political phase of moral puritanism criminalized and banned, she ended up providing. Ciudad Juarez became stuffed with bars, distilleries, brothels, and opium dens which Americans could access by simply crossing the border from El Paso, Texas. This is where a story that would deeply hurt, injure, and traumatize Mexico began. Through murdering competitors and building alliances, she ended up building an empire of bars, brothels, opium dens, heroin labs, and smuggling routes for liquor, heroin, cocaine, marijuana, and women that stretched across the border, earning her the nickname Queen of the Border. In 1930, business exploded when she bribed and murdered her way into becoming the main supplier of marijuana for Americans, and by the 1940s, the main supplier of hemp for rope production to the United States Armed Forces. She cemented her power by another means that would end up becoming a local practice. She simply bribed Mexican government officials to ignore her criminal network. Her network wouldn't end until American pressure forced her arrest after the Second World War, and after that, she became largely forgotten. She doesn't even have her own Wikipedia entry, and many don't even know that the first of the notorious Mexican drug cartels was founded by a woman. Her organization would divide up into the cartels of Juarez, Sonora, and Sinaloa, and the way that Northern Mexican society had been structured furthered this socio-economic development. Since the days of the first Spanish communities of settlers, the North had been tough to govern and to assert the authority of the state over. These communities of majority white Hispanics became self-sufficient, autonomous, and independent, with governance mostly being local and organized around the wealthiest member of the community, the patron. When you boil everything down to basics, a criminal organization is an out-of-state and non-state actor, an entity of its own norms and customs outside of the society of law that can exist either in competition, leeching off, or in cooperation with state entities. It is therefore not surprising that when the illegal drug trade emerged at the beginning of the 20th century with the criminalization of narcotics, that it was out-of-state and non-state entities that took over that market. From the tribes of northern Burma, to the hill people of Afghanistan, to the goons and gangs that had controlled Italian cities, to the semi-autonomous patrons who had power over the hard-to-reach and neglected.
This is important. And there's a really good series. You know, if you watch the series about El Chapo in Netflix, I don't know if you have that in the USA. If not, you can use a VPN and get a Mexican IP to watch that, because it's really useful, because it shows you a lot of that.
Parts of Colombia and Mexico. Being a stateless entity doesn't make you a narco-trafficker. However, having the convenience of the location and economic structure does. Borders are, when you boil it down, mostly not natural things. Only a few countries have natural borders. Most borders represent the limitations of a social construct, namely the economy of scale, the extent to which a society and its institutions can reach and exert its authority. This means that cross-border interaction, be it in form of commerce, to culture, to marriages, will always and have always been a thing. Show me a border and I will show you a population overlap. Walk through Vienna and you will notice how many people speak Hungarian. And when an economy of scale exerts restrictions and limitations on trade and commerce, the primary beneficiary of such are those who border that economy of scale. Something not available in place A can be made available by place B, even if illegal in place A. The simplistic sounding solution of just ban what is desired because of reason X often causes more harm than it does any good. You also don't have to use this obvious example of the Mexican-American war on drugs to show why. This is White Clay, a town of 14 people in the state of Nebraska. Going through White Clay is Highway 87, which leads to South Dakota and into Pine Ridge, or more precisely, the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation owned by the Oglala Lakota. The Pine Ridge Reservation has been plagued with widespread alcoholism. Due to the widespread poverty and limited means of the community, they could not provide extensive services for rehabilitation and the kind of healthcare institutions that would help people with addiction problems. Therefore, prohibition of alcohol was enacted across the community instead. But in White Clay, which is outside of Pinewood and the state of South Dakota, alcohol remained legal. The result was that this community, with a population of 14, ended up having half a dozen liquor stores, selling millions of cans and bottles of booze and beer to Lakota Indians who often on foot trekked down Highway 87 from Pinewood into White Clay to buy alcohol.
Wow, oh my God.
And then, drunk or while drinking, staggered back into Pinewood on Highway 87. This infamously resulted in this small stretch of highway having the highest numbers of fatalities in vehicular-to-person traffic accidents across the United States. White Clay sucked the lifeblood out of the Lakota people until the state of Nebraska shut it down by refusing to renew the White Clay liquor licenses. Two economies of scale where one took advantage of the other. One community became rich at the cost of the other, which wallowed further into poverty and despair. The rigorous prohibition enforced especially on drugs would end up being something that the cartels of northern Mexico would take advantage of. The United States Border Patrol was initially founded in 1924 to try and clamp down on the smuggling of alcohol across the Mexican border, a task at which it failed. Meanwhile, immigration into the United States increased as tens of thousands of Mexican laborers came to work on farms and other industries. Some of those stayed in the United States even after the war, but those with the most significant impact for Mexico itself were those who returned with capital and skills that they had acquired during their stay in the United States. And a different socio-political shift also impacted the United States internally. Mexican Americans and Latinos in general within the United States started to re-emerge in the wider cultural and political framework. The historian Juan Gonzalez divides this process up into 4 periods. The integration period from 1950 to 1964, when Mexican Americans started increasingly participating within the politics of the United States as voters. This was particularly pushed by the large Mexican community of California and Texas, and it had its greatest triumph in 1960 when Kennedy was elected with 85% of the Mexican American vote, making it very clear that Mexican Americans were now part and parcel of American electoral politics. the radical nationalist period from 1965 to 1974, when Latinos in America organized in political radical protest movements such as the Brown Berets, and took part in the wider protest movements of the Civil Rights Movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement. Less concerned with integration in the political process and appearing to be respected.
I love listening about Mexican Americans and their history. I think it's really interesting, and I think we should learn about it as well. Plus, I think it's Hispanic Heritage Month, right? I mean, today is September 17. Mexican independence was a couple of years ago, where I should have posted this video, but I couldn't at the end. And yeah, so in honor of Hispanic Heritage Month and Mexican independence, y'all should give it a like, give this video a like, subscribe, and maybe support me on my links in the video description.
To the Anglo-majority population, it helped to shape and determine a distinctive Latino culture and identity within the United States. Its greatest legacies are Mexican-American common legal defense funds, labor unions such as the one led by Cesar Chavez, and voting rights activism groups. Which leads us into the voting rights period from 1975 to 1984. At the end of the Nixon era, the involvement in radical and revolutionary movements amongst Mexican Americans sharply declined. Instead, a generation of young Latino lawyers and political activists started using the institutions founded by radicals to tie more Latinos into the American political process through voter registration, legal defense funds, political campaigns, running for office, and acquiring institutional and electoral power within the United States. A process which increased with the anti-immigration policies under Nixon to protect Mexican Americans from deportation and discrimination.
I'm surprised a lot of times. I've been to a lot of cities in the US, and the amount of information available in Spanish, it's unbelievable. I mean, in the Houston bus, for example, the stops would be read on the speaker in English and in Spanish, and those small details are very important, and maybe not to me because I'm able to speak English, but I guess to a lot of people those are very, very important. I saw the voting signs that were written in English and Spanish, and sometimes in even more languages like Chinese. I saw once in Arabic. That's nice about America. It feels it's a wholesome feeling when you see that your culture is being at least taken into account. Your language is being taken into account. And I know a lot of people don't like it and feel like, America only English, which is fair. It's not totally unfair, but maybe in the future I think there's going to be a little bit more cultural integration.
Were extremely successful and led to the Third Force period from 1985 to today. The American presidential, Senate, and congressional elections of 1984, 1986, 1988, and 1990 are often overlooked but incredibly important in the development of the current American political framework. During the presidential elections, Reagan was consistently re-elected as Democratic voters lost an increasing share of white Anglo voters. But at the same time, the share of Latino and African American voters kept continuously chewing away at those gains. Additionally, more and more Latino and African American senators and members of Congress started to get elected. By the early 1990s, the Latino minority of the United States had firmly established themselves as an important political force with institutional and electoral power within the United States. It made it close to impossible to win elections in states like California, Texas, New York, New Mexico, Florida, and Arizona without appealing to Latino voters or some extensive gerrymandering. Latinos became the third force in American electoral politics after white Americans and African Americans. By the year 2000 and 2004, the Republican President George Bush had to launch both his election and re-election efforts with an appeal to Latino voters to succeed, which includes the last time a Republican won the popular vote. The living standards of Mexican Americans started to rise. Prominent political leaders emerged. The United States increasingly became a place where citizens of Mexican ancestry could build a life, a community, and prosper. The California investment banker Dan Pena was one of the first wealthy Mexican American businessmen to emerge from this socio-economic development. But the story of Dan Pinner, as well as the stories of other successful and wealthy Mexican Americans, be they Hollywood actors, businessmen, innovators, social media influencers and more, or other upper middle class Mexican Americans, be they lawyers, scientists, doctors, engineers, small business owners and more, they also tell us a different story. There are 100,000 wealthy Mexican Americans in the United States with an annual income of more than $50,000. This means that there are more wealthy Mexican Americans than there are wealthy Mexicans.
Yeah, so true,
If you
so
lived in
true.
Nogales,
Houston is a great example. I met a lot of wealthy Mexicans and Mexican Americans. Of course, that's an aspiration of mine, and these people represent great inspiration for me. And I don't know, it's wholesome. It's wholesome.
Sonora from 1950 to the year 2000, you were able to watch Nogales, Arizona, and notice a gradual process in which the standard of living and average wealth of Mexican Americans increased, while Mexicans became poorer. The improvement of Mexican American living standards coincided with a deterioration of the Mexican living conditions. Between 1950 and 1952, the declaration of the
It's like movie. This is like movies. Always when there's an American movie and they show Mexico, they have this strange orange filter, and I don't know why. I never understood why. Is that really how y'all look? Maybe because of the desert climate of the border. Maybe it's a way to tell the American brain this is Mexico. I don't know, but it's just strange, man. Like,
the Mexican living conditions.
I guess that happens, you know. For example, a lot of if an American movie, it's in Russia or any other Slavic country, they will add a blue-like filter, or Scandinavia. So, you know, I guess, you know, Mexico is not the only victim, right? Because that's not an issue. Who cares?
Between 1950 and 1952, the Mexican state had cracked down with riot police against strikes by city taxi drivers, student protests, and protests by indigenous peoples against the kleptocracy of the Mexican state. Where once the army was used as a tool of repression, an increasingly corrupt police force was now used to clamp down against those who protested the state or the economic interests of an ever smaller group of wealthy Mexicans well connected within the one-party system. The PRI won 98% of all mayoral elections between 1940 and 1980. It won all post-war gubernatorial elections until the 1990s. One of the most brazen examples of how complete and all-encompassing and authoritarian the PRI state had become was when Dr. Salvador Nava ran for the office of mayor in San Luis Potosi in 1958. His election rallies were marred by violence and agitators. The PRI forged the election results and sent the Mexican army to beat up students who had protested those results. A general strike occurred that forced the PRI to acknowledge the real election results, but when Nava ran for governor in 1961, the PRI cracked down hard. Hundreds of supporters and campaign activists ended up in jail charged with dubious crimes with dubious evidence under dubious circumstances. Nava was arrested and tortured by the police, and in the end the election results were simply forged again. Throughout the world, many praised Mexico as Latin America's only functioning democracy, but at least by 1954, the Mexican Revolutionary Republic was at best a sham democracy. It was members of the PRI who became the governors of states, the heads of police, and the executives of large state industries. And those members of the PRI came to increasingly resemble the caudillos that they claimed to replace. If you wanted to do private business and get concessions for such, you increasingly needed to bribe your local PRI boss for the privilege. If you were a very rich businessman, you sought
noticing
a
a trend here?
An alliance of powerful PRI
A very,
members
very
to
sad
secure
trend.
those interests through bribery. State industry sectors and factories opened up in parts of the country not because they were in any way economically viable, but because they were agreed to be built in a certain location through some backdoor deal made between a businessman or the federal government and the governor of the location to secure alliances and favors amongst an increasingly sealed off and inaccessible political and economic elite. Foreign influence increasingly returned into the Mexican economy. Although the law demanded that 51% of any business in Mexico had to be owned by Mexicans, numerous loopholes were created to bypass this, so American capital could bring industry to Mexico. The
Shut up
PRI
and
was
take
never
my
able to
dollars.
envision or provide structures that gave ordinary Mexicans the ability to do business. Even the economic booms of the 40s, 50s, and 60s were largely carried on the backs of Mexican migrant laborers in the United States and the American capital that they brought with them back to Mexico through their wages. But the PRI, instead of reforming, which would have meant decreasing their power and giving average Mexicans more power and the ability to do business, the PRI merely backed increasing American investment in Mexico, hoping that the Americans would develop, industrialize, and modernize Mexico. That, however, did not happen. Whatever wages the increasing American presence paid out to average Mexican workers, those were not able to effectively use their capital in their own ventures, as much of it went lost in an increasingly corrupt state. If you had an idea, an innovation, or an education that would have allowed you to open a business, doing so was exceedingly difficult. You had to sift through the enormous bureaucracy that the PRI had created. In the end, it became just easier and consequently the custom to find the right friends or to bribe your way into business or to just leave for the United States. That consequently stifled innovation, economic modernization, and concentrated economic...
Yeah, Mexico is probably one of the countries who suffers of brain drain the most. I mean, it's incredible when you see the numbers of young people of all fields. You know, I'm talking sports as well. A lot of them, they simply go to the U.S., and entrepreneurs, they go to the U.S. Smart people, scientists, they go to the U.S. because it makes sense. I mean, why wouldn't you? But it's just really complicated. Really. It just makes things a lot harder.
Economic power and capital, even more within an increasingly small elite. Even worse, the gangsters who ran the ever-growing illegal drug trade made backroom deals with the Ministry of the Interior to keep the drug trade running. Organized criminal groups started taking control over many hard-to-reach parts of the country and large parts of the north. Through protection rackets, they stifled most locals from engaging in economic activity and dominated much of the local society. The Mexican government claimed to be fighting a war against drugs since the 1970s, but in reality, right up to the year 2000, it only pretended to be fighting the drug cartels. In reality, some of the most highest-ranking government officials, right up into the Interior Ministry, had deals with the various drug cartels, allowing them to do business and take control over parts of the country in exchange for a fee to the ministry. This would be catastrophic for Mexico. The PRI effectively surrendered sovereignty over parts of the country to organized crime in exchange for cash starting in the 1950s. And Mexico is still struggling to regain control over these regions to this very day. As much as the new state may have professed progress and social justice through its reforms and appearance, at its core the institutions of the state remained outdated, broken, and favorable for the establishment of a corrupt oligarchy. The state tried to brandish an image of progress through mass events such as hosting the Olympics and 2 World Cups, but one only had to peek beneath the glittering facade to see the true monster. When African-American athletes protested racial segregation at the Mexico City Olympics, the PRI state used a law that enabled the deportation of foreigners for ensuring demographic stability to swiftly deport them to the United States. The Mexico World Cup was marred by protests by working-class Mexicans against the enormous costs which were brutally cracked down upon by the state. State industries did not fare much better. Just as previous oligarchs had secured their interests in their mining and plantation sectors, the PRI executives who came to run the national oil and mining companies schemed with the central government to keep control, power, and profit of their institutions. The new cooperative Ejido farms were excellent for those who worked on them. Growing corn for mainly domestic markets, it meant that receiving a job on such meant generational security in income. However, these farms limited in markets to Mexico, where through the fact that they were cut off from wider global markets, they became increasingly uncompetitive. The farmers didn't innovate, didn't try to improve their work system. They found the standard by which to work and supply the domestic market and stuck by it. This made these farms extremely vulnerable. Within the state-owned industries, executive positions and often even other jobs were increasingly not handed out on the basis of skill and achievement, but on the basis of who your friends, family, and their connections were. Some services, though, worked better than others, even though the state structures remained broken. The Mexican Institute for Social Security, established in 1959, has been plagued by many corruption scandals. But it is the reason why, when you cross the border from one Nogales into the other Nogales, that the healthcare in Mexican Nogales is better than the healthcare in American Nogales. However, the reason why nothing else functions in Nogales as it should is the Mexican state that the PRI created.
That's the only thing that
state
works.
Was powerful in its institutions, but built to limit that power within the hands of the PRI. It furthered corruption, embezzlement, and negligence, a phony leviathan that increasingly started to lose control over decades. Corrupt governors, corrupt police chiefs, and gangsters increasingly seized control over parts of the country and were allowed to do so under the protective shield of the PRI.
Even the police.
Mexico again became the kind of state where the governor of a state had a brother who became the police chief of the state. His uncle ran the mining complex of the state, and his son-in-law became the head of the local cooperative farm, even though that son-in-law didn't even know what farming was. The PRI was less of a democratic party and more of a PR campaign. A PR campaign that managed to successfully create an illusion of democracy, separation of powers, and individual rights and liberties. It could be right-wing, it could be left-wing, it could be populist, it could be elitist, it could be whatever it needed to present itself to be to the Mexican public and the wider world. It became Mexico's politics party, the party of all politics, and therefore no politics.
You can't really tell if they're lefties or right-wingers.
Then as the Party of Business in the late 50s, the Anti-Corruption Party in the 60s, the People's Party in the 70s, the Neoliberal Free Market Party in the 1980s, and sometimes it presented itself as everything at once. A complete clusterfudge of contradictory policies in a massive PR campaign meant to hide just how self-serving and incompetent a den of corrupt bureaucrats the PRI actually was. A state with very limited space for citizens to politically participate or change anything, that engaged in brutal massacres of protesters and the violent suppression of Native American communities, a place where journalists lived in danger and where corrupt officials and gangsters acted in complete impunity. And yet, the PRI state remained widely praised and acknowledged around the world as a supposed beacon of democracy for Latin America. Then, the facade collapsed.
Oh, all right. So we're gonna leave these here because I have to check the recording. I don't want it to mess up. Plus, I have to rest. The headphone space hurts. But if you like this video, I would really appreciate if you give it a like, give it a subscribe. It really helps me a lot with the YouTube algorithm. I would also appreciate if you could check out my links, as well as if you support the original creator, because my God, he's creating a piece of art. So, without further ado, I'll see you in the next video.